האתגר השלישי שעומד לפנינו הוא בניית ציר לשיתוף פעולה אזורי. אני חושב שזה לא רק אתגר, זו גם הזדמנות.
Good evening. We now have the last session. I know I feel that we're going to remain solely here in the... Oh, there's a story. My wife really likes the songs by Carlebach, and one day she said there's a performance of a singer singing Carlebach songs. We have to go. We bought tickets. I ran from work and we went to listen to Carlebach. We came to the hall. Hanan Yoel, the singer, is there. We were 10 people in the hall. He came with an orchestra and musicians and singers, and he gave a performance as if it were a full hall. So we'll try to do the same. We don't see what's happening because of the lights. We have a panel now, and now we are looking with a wider scope at the region. We have a list of people from various walks of life who can talk about the opportunities and the capabilities vis-à-vis the region. There are all sorts of initiatives happening now that they talk about Israel and regional peace and regional collaboration. And does Israel have opportunity during this time and the turbulence that's going on? But those who participate is Professor Elie Podeh. If you know him, he's from the Faculty of Islam and Middle East in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. I studied there as well. Although the institute is close to Tel Aviv University, I'm a graduate of Jerusalem. He's been dealing for years about the Middle East. He also sees our failures in the capability to reach agreements with Palestinians and Arab countries. The second one, you all know Major General Amos Gilad, who today, maybe he won't like it, but sorry, Amos, that I'm saying it, but maybe he is our foreign minister to the Arab world. He's the head of the political unit in the Ministry of Defense. And I go over to the lady before our guest from abroad, and that is Orit Perlov. She's in INSS. She researches the social networks and manages somehow to give us a different flavor to the things that we see here in the Middle East. And last but not least, our guest from abroad, Andrew Tabler. He is the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He specializes on Syria and the American policy in these areas. And we're going to have a conversation, less presentations, but more a talk between us in order to understand whether we do have opportunities in this region. So Amos, can we start with you? By the way, Amos just landed a few minutes ago. He was flying in, and I really appreciate you being here. Are we really in a period that we have a special opportunity because of the fact that we have a scope of mutual interest, definitely with the peace countries, but also Arab countries? I don't know how to call them. They call them moderate. I'm not sure moderate is the right word. Maybe pragmatic. As a result of the joint threats, Iran and Daesh, ISIS, and everything that's happening around here. And is there a special period now that we can take advantage of in order to improve the relationship? Well, good evening. I'm so blinded, I think the hall is full, but we'll check that later. Usually we focus on threats. It's more attractive. When I was the spokesman of the IDF, there was a newspaper called Good News. It collapsed after 3 weeks. Although we have the Iranian threat and all sorts of other threats that we make a living from quite well, there are opportunities. There's an interesting phenomenon in the Arab world. All the kingdoms, including Bahrain, 90% Shiites, 10% Sunni, all the kingdoms the royal houses managed to survive what they call it, whatever they call it, the Arab Spring. There's no spring. Anyway, they survived. And you can analyze whether there are countries or states or stable entities, so now you can have estimates how long they're going to survive. As for King Hussein, who was anointed as the heir, and he actually died of cancer after many years, and all the people who estimated this, that, and the other died before him. I'm not sure we understand well the Arab world, but I think that their power and their inner stability is much higher than what we think. And another phenomenon, which is like a miracle, what's happening in Egypt. Little by little, I start believing in miracles. There are too many miracles that happen to us in such a harsh reality. And the problem with the miracles, you cannot plan them. What happened in Egypt is a miracle. Not everybody likes it. In the West, many people don't like it because they're not democratic. So if the Muslim Brothers, in a strategic point of view, would succeed to go into the Arab military, which is stronger than the Arab state, this is an economic, military, strategic entity, and already there's an alliance between it and Syria and Turkey. We would have been in a very bad situation with a threat on our eastern border. People who are familiar about it, people don't write about it. It's boring, but it has a great implication because Jordan, I felt the anxiety at the time when this alliance took place. And then Sisi, general, who was appointed by the Muslim Brothers, he was promoted in his position, became the Minister of Defense because of patriotic reasons. I mean, for the benefit of Egypt, he decided to turn everything topsy-turvy, to throw out the Muslim Brothers. And then he was under pressure because by definition of the American law, it's coup d'etat. Coup in the United States is something that Sisi said, I'm going to throw them out or they'll fight me. It's true that the Muslim Brothers, who were founded in 28, you cannot just eradicate them by decision, but politically you can oppress them, you can weaken them. So this was the decision he made, and as a result of that, the alliance with Turkey collapsed. Erdogan was going to come to Gaza and to flame the entire Arab world. I'm not going to elaborate, but Obama personally asked him, don't go. And he said, I will. And now he can't come because he can't get a visa. He needs either a permission from us to go to Gaza or from Cairo, and he can't get either. So Egypt went back to a very important leadership position with all the inherent weaknesses. All the problems there, economy and society, and today, and here I answer your question, we are facing this Sunni Arab cluster, and my conclusions that peace agreement, or I don't think it's possible, anything that contradicts the Arab street, but we do have a common denominator, that in a very clever way we can come to collaboration and very positive relations. So that's actually the reality. If you mean what? What collaborations? More focused? No. Wide in covert issues. If I translate it from the world of security, Jordan, if you look to the east, where is the security border of Israel? It's between Iraq and Jordan. It's not the river that in the summer you need a GPS to find it. It says the biblical Jordanian river. If we take a plane, we get to the borders of 67, then Judea and Samaria, then we cross the Jordan, you go up the mountain, you come to Amman, and this is a paradise for terror. All the organizations who want to come, and then we have the whole space till Iraq. All this is completely quiet. You can say it's deceiving quiet, you can say quiet before the storm, but I think their stability is stronger. There's something in this method. We have here a scope which is equal to the word in Hebrew, classical word, which is blood and money. It's a pun in Hebrew. There's nothing from behavior of the Arab because they're Zionists, but the common denominator is all these Daesh and ISIS and ISIL. They keep changing their name. Now they call it IS, vis-a-vis the terror of Sinai and the Iranian Shiite threat from the east and Hezbollah, and vis-a-vis the collapse of Syria. So here I declare the death of Syria. By the way, it is now 3 entities. It's an enclave of Hezbollah. Somebody gets a salary as a president, but he's actually a governor. There's no funeral announced yet. Lebanon is gone long ago. Iraq definitely doesn't deserve the title of state. Libya is a funny entity. Anyway, these are not states. And I can go on with the list. And this very massive, heavy block of Saudi Arabia and all the royalties like Jordan and all the Emirates, whatever, it's peace. It's not peace like Europe, but there's a big common denominator vis-a-vis enemies, and you have to take advantage of it, but also to be sensitive. With Jordan, everything that's happening in the Temple Mount, even if it's a small incident, can really reflect on Jordan. There was a very deep reflection, and I'm very happy that the government decided, or the state decided, to take things in hand and to change the order of priorities and investing resources, and the result is that quiet is restored, and the ambassador from Jordan came back. The fact that he came back, it's more important than what it was, because it means that the great security values that we really need, you cannot solve everything with an army. Army is the last resort. Using military force is the last resort. The army is essential for deterrence, but you do have to exert more means. You create a common denominator. And with the Arab world that I'm talking about, we are in an unprecedented common denominator. Where we will not succeed, I think anything that is beyond this area, the Arab street or the Arab public opinion, or normalization with the state of Israel, or anything that has to do with the Palestinian problem, all these things, if they are not solved, they're not going to ever have normal, overt relations with us like between France and Germany after the Second World War. Therefore, the scope of opportunities is incredible, but it all has to be covered without any leaks, so I'm not going into details. And definitely there's a strategic opportunity here, and I think that relatively we are taking advantage of it, and so do they. There's a mutual benefits here, and there's a huge scope for activity, but as long as it's under the rules that are relevant. All in all, we should always respect the Arab side. They have their own sensitivities. There is a common denominator, and most of the things cannot be overground, but they do serve us existentially. I'm not exaggerating. It's not that we shall live or die, but Israel has to prioritize. Look how many threats we have. So this security diplomacy saves us a lot of resources and a lot of blood. If I look to the east, there are so many factors there that can explode, and still quiet is maintained. You can always say that it's still tomorrow. Tomorrow in Israel is a very long time from now. Thank you, Amos.
Elie, I'd like to ask you at this point, there are 2 processes that need to be addressed. The first is that for the last 13 years, since the Arabs have put on the table the Arab Initiative, and they keep ratifying it each and every year, and yet we have a phenomenon that we are being exposed to time and again, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has really hit rock bottom. It is no longer on anyone's priority list in the Arab world. The Arab world is much more engaged in more complex things, and the question is, maybe this is an opportunity to take this Arab initiative and to reach with it an agreement or an understanding between us and the Arab world, or have we missed the boat? Well, first of all, good evening, everyone. Before I answer your specific question, I would like to go from the general to particular. and to say how can we place this question within the broader issue of the Israeli foreign policy. And here I would like to say something that is very general about Israeli policy and the need for it to change. I have also been active in an institute called Mitvim, which is an institute that deals with regional foreign policy. And the annual project focuses on the Israeli foreign policy paradigm by way of trying to see whether it can be drafted differently. And we see that the principles of the Israeli foreign policy need to be based on 3 or 4 principles. I don't want to go in depth into this matter, but I just want to make note of them. The first principle is an active foreign policy that is peace-oriented, and I'm talking about an active policy, and I will soon explain what that means. The second principle is an Israeli foreign policy that is multi-regional, and that is where the Arab Peace Initiative comes in. And the third principle is a policy which faces the world. There are 3 places in the world: the United States, Europe, and world Jewry. And these are 3 planes, 3 areas where we need to to turn around the way we think. And as for the first one, in general, when we look at Israeli foreign policy, it is a policy that was usually passive. Traditionally, it was a policy that adopted the status quo, embraced the status quo, and only changed it when there was no other choice, except for some exceptions, like during Rabin's term in office, 1992 to 1995. Now, where do we see it practically? And here I bring my own materials from my own academic studies. I have completed a study that centers on missing opportunities in the Israeli-Arab conflict. And humorously, sometimes people say, how many volumes did you write? Well, it's just 1 volume, but it deals with all the opportunities that have been missed throughout the conflict since the Faisal-Weizmann agreement and the last round, Netanyahu-Abu Mazen. And what we see very clearly is that Israel did not initiate. I will say did not, but it was very rarely initiated. I could say it did not at all, but I will say it very rarely initiated. Usually the initiator was the United States. Some of the initiatives, perhaps surprisingly, 7 came from the Arab world, including 2 initiatives by Sadat, 2 initiatives by the Saudis. One of them is the most recent Arab initiative that began with Saudi Arabia, and the initiatives from Israel's side are very few, if any. And I don't want to go into it too much, but I can really dismiss all of them. If we talk about the most well-known, which is Shamir's peace initiative, which is a bit of an oxymoron, we must say, because Shamir, who was well known for the most rigid and most extreme prime minister, politically speaking, was the one who had a peace initiative, which, by the way, was completely an empty shell, and it was a bit more of a public PR stunt. But the bottom line is that Israel is not an initiator, and therefore we would like to create a more active policy. Now, there are huge advantages to that, and I can make note of several. It will improve Israel's status in the international arena. It will decrease or perhaps stop the BDS. It will improve the economic situation, the financial situation. It will minimize anti-Semitism. There are huge advantages. The other part is the multi-regional policy, and here that has to do more with your question. Here what we say is that Israel needs to actually leave behind this perception that says that we must be alone, or the ghetto perception. This is the sort of view we brought with us from Europe, or the sort of approach that came also from the Arab countries, that we are in a hostile environment and therefore we constantly need to protect ourselves and defend ourselves. That does not mean that in certain conditions or under certain circumstances this was really true. But to come and say that it was always true and that was always the situation, well, much has been said about the threats that surround us, ISIS and Iran and so forth, but very little has been said about what can be done in this opportunity. And here again I want to bring history into play, because a lot has been said about how we haven't been in a worse situation with our enemies. Well, let's take 1958 as an example. Nasser was in the peak of his prime. He was after what was perceived in 1956 as a victory. He is a leader in Egypt like Iran is today, and then in February they go together with Syria, and Israel is in the middle. In May a civil war starts in Lebanon, and in July a military coup takes place in Iraq that topples the Western monarchy in Iraq, which was the Western frontier, so to speak. This is what Israel has to deal with, and of course this is a terrible feeling. And here Ben Gurion took action. What did he do? He adopted the periphery policy, which said, okay, we have quite a few countries and elements and factors here that want to cooperate against a common enemy. Like the common enemy today is ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Iran. At the time, the common enemy was Egypt and Nasser. And who can collaborate with us? Turkey, Iran. That sounds completely crazy. But these two countries that we would never ever collaborate with today, they were Muslim countries that had diplomatic ties with us and had the interest. And today, you remind me of the MKs we saw today. Well, I am a historian. Okay, so now let's go back to the present. I think that the decision makers, first and foremost, need to look at this region and see what can be done. And quite a lot can be done, as has been said before. And I would like to read out to you a sentence, a single sentence that Netanyahu said in the UN in September 2004. There is a new Middle East, and it presents new dangers, but also new opportunities. Israel is willing to collaborate with regional countries in order to demilitarize the radical Islam and to prevent the Iranian nuclear program. So even Netanyahu understands this. And of course there are people who are in a better situation to say what is being done behind the scenes. I understand that quite a lot is being done. But we must remember that whatever is done, and it's very good, and we talked about the moderate states, which is Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and the Gulf states and Morocco. There are quite a few entities that are stable, reasonably stable, and can be collaborated with, especially when it happens behind the scenes. But here the paradox is that it needs to be resolved, is that what actually takes place is something I call the lovers syndrome. Israel is collaborating with the Arab states behind the scenes, and that's okay and it's legitimate, and in the absence of any other choice, that's what should be done. But at the end of the day, our goal should be to get out of this syndrome, and we can only do this once we solve the Palestinian issue, because on the street, the Arab street, they will not allow it unless we solve and resolve the Palestinian problem. And I'm not coming and saying that once we resolve the Palestinian problem, everything else will also be resolved, but I do think that when we make steps towards such a resolution, this will definitely promote us in the region. And the Arab Initiative has already been published in 2002, and some say it was irrelevant because there was an Arab Spring and some of the countries are no longer relevant, but the Arab League, who will be convening shortly, are still talking about it. It's still part of the Arab country's agenda. It is no more than a platform. It is not a peace plan. It is simply a one-page proposal. But Israel has never accepted it. Israel has never discussed it. And I think that is a huge chance missed by Israel. It's an opportunity that should have been taken advantage of. It should have been promoted. And I think that if we have reached a dead end of the Palestinians, this is the time to promote this peace initiative, because it is another lever through which we can cope with the Palestinian issue and try and rise above this tear between Hamas and Fatah that is quite an impediment. Well, thank you very much. Well, since we talked about the image of the lover, so to speak, that we should be concealing this relationship, and Amos also said that the covert is better than the overt, I have asked Orit to do a sort of dialogue. It's not exactly a survey, it's a sort of dialogue with those that are taking part in the dialogue in social networks in the Arab world, and to revisit the question, is it true that the relationship between those Arab leaders way up at the top of the pyramid with Israel, because the public down at the bottom are not willing to accept such a relationship? So can you please present us with your findings of the questions you have asked and the sort of answers you were given?
What you're going to see now, every year I have a lot of talks with opinion decision makers. I just came back from abroad. There's a galaxy that's called today social network. 3 million Arabs of the Middle East is on my galaxy and can talk and explain what's going on. So I asked them, what do you think we'll see in 2015? And then I'll be happy to answer about the opportunities and what can we do above the table rather than under. Here I can see you better. Let's begin. What I did before I came here, I tried to understand from that public opinion, to see the trends, which we can see this year as well. I try to ask people, you know, I sit in Tel Aviv, in another 40 kilometers I can be in Damascus, Cairo or Beirut. I try to understand from them what they think, what's going to happen in 2015, what we're going to focus on in the Middle East, and what are we going to talk about next year. So the first thing I want to show you is the boots on the Shiite boots on the ground. And then I'll talk a little bit about the revolving doors, the young and the restless. What's going to happen to young people in 4 years if you open that kettle? And if you want to cover the pots, it's impossible because of all this fermentation underneath. And the third thing that we can see, the lone wolves, you'll hear about it tomorrow. But I'll say a few words because these things together apparently are going to be in the news in the next year. I hope you come to the answer to the questions I asked also. If you want me, well, please, because time is short, I just want in a nutshell. And I'll talk about opportunities. But last September, the President of the United States appeared in the White House and he said two things that don't go together. He was supposed to talk about the war against ISIS, and he said two things. We want to degrade and ultimately destroy. And the second thing he said, there'll be no boots on the ground, no American forces in Syria and America. It's all going to be by air. So since these are two things that are not connected, the public understand that they cannot live together. You can't destroy the ISIL from the air. So they offer other options. They say instead of boots, we'll put Birkenstock, the very famous gym shoes, or golf. And the other option is to walk on your hands, because you cannot finish the ISIL from the air. So if not boots, it can be hands. The people who thought it, somebody else said, instead of us, maybe somebody else can do it. They hoped that all these years that they built and armed the Iraqi military, so when Daesh comes in 2014, they were hoping that the Iraqis are going to be boots on the ground, but they took their boots, they took their feet, they left their helmets, they left the uniform, and they ran away. The third phase was the hope that maybe the Arabs will agree to be the boots on the ground. That is one thing that the Arabs understood. It says, don't do unto others what you hate. Don't put the boots in a neighboring country if you don't want the boots to reach your country as well. So if the Americans or the Iraqis do not put the boots, neither do the Arabs, then meet this man. This is Soleimani, and the boots that we'll hear about a lot in the next year is Qasim's boots. I can tell you a little bit about the Arab League, but at the moment this man controls 3 capitals, Beirut, Mecca, and Baghdad, and now we're talking about Sana'a, and that's without mentioning Tehran. That's the trend. You can see Iran eating up the Middle East, and its hands is all over the place. That's how the Arabs see it. The other thing is the revolving doors. Young people who came out 4 years ago, they wanted justice and democracy. We see you want to put a cork on the public, but they cannot. And then 4 years passed on. The man goes out of prison, and those 40,000 youngsters in prisons, in military camps, you see what happened. The people who led the revolution, 6th of April, they go into prison, and he and his sons go out. It's true in Egypt, but it's also true in other republics. And I think that can really conceptualize the things. And the last thing we can see, those lone wolves. This guy is called Islamic Yadin. He's a chemistry student. He's a sports trainer. One guy, and the other guy is called Surshi. He's Kurdish. And another one is Osman, a medical student. This is a doctor from Kurdistan. And we have a medical student. They're all 20 years old, and they are lone wolves. These are people who lost their hope in what's common, although they're old students and educated and graduated from the academe, but they chose to join ISIS and its military. So, nevertheless, I'm very frustrated now. I want to know a few things. Those people who describe their trends, what are their expectations from the State of Israel? Do they see capability to have normal relations between the Arab world, the Arab society, the Arab communities, and the State of Israel? Is the State of Israel perceived as a problem, maybe as a solution? Can we feel that there's a real change based on which we can create these opportunities for collaboration? So, 3 things. First of all, most of the Arab countries deal with internal issues. Israel is the last thing that's on their mind. They deal with reforms and all these challenges that at the moment were exposed. That spring took out all the pus from the wound. And in the beginning they thought of how to create reforms and topple the regime. Now they're dealing with the results, but we are not the focus of the Arab world at the moment. And of course it can change tomorrow, but at the moment they're dealing with internal issues. And that's why we see now too, we really wanted in the last war that people will come and help us shorten the last operation, Protective Edge, but the Arab world was not interested. They said it's very sad, and it's a humanitarian problem, which happens with Palestinians, but it's not a strategic problem, and that's why we didn't see great demonstrations in the Arab world. They said that solidarity died. If until now the Palestinian issue looked like some sort of a sick organ in healthy body, now the entire body is ill. Egyptians kill more Egyptians than Palestinians. There are more casualties or fatalities in Syria, Iraq, Libya. so that the Arab public opinion, that's what they're focusing on, you know, the attacks of Egypt in Libya, 2 rounds in order to attack the Islamic State, Jordan, Bahrain, they attack within Syria, so we are not the focus. But together with that, when I asked them what things can we do together, there were, above table, of course, there were 3 very clear topics. They said the following. Summer 2013 and 14, Egypt, Jordan, and Libya were black, not because of Daesh, but because there's no electricity. There's a real problem of gas and electricity in these countries. And they said very clearly, everything that has to do with transactions that have to do with energies or resources today in Egypt, mineral water costs more than fuel. Not because they don't have water, but because their water management is so problematic. So anything that has to do with water and gas and transactions, the young people in the public view, they're ready to accept transactions that have to do with water, gas, and electricity. They said that next summer, they said it as a joke, that Israel is going to take over electricity in Egypt. Also, they cannot deal with their internal problems while dealing with the terror. So in any war, some people get rich, and this time it's these people who build walls and fences. All of them want to fence themselves, to cover themselves with fences, so anybody in the defense industry who wants to teach how to build fences and walls, I think you can make a very good business from it. And the third and most important thing, the young generation, both in Jordan, Lebanon, Libya, and Egypt, they deal with 2 main topics. One is telecommunication, the other one is high-tech. They're very interested in that. So the traditional professions at the moment are not available. They don't want to be civil servants, also law or legal professions. They go to university, they don't find works. But high-tech, and they're willing to collaborate. Jordan, Lebanon, they know that in order to create telecommunication and high-tech market, it's not enough to do it inwardly. It has to be regional. So electricity, water, telecommunication and high-tech, definitely there's a lot of willingness for collaboration with Israel. Thank you. Andrew.
Okay, Toda. Andrew, I would like to jump to the Golan Heights, or Syria. As we see now, there is an offensive Iran leading by, Quds commander Hezbollah in southern Syria against the rebels there. Do you see any opportunities to Israel during that crisis in Syria?
First of all, thanks very much for the invitation to be here today. Thank you. I'm getting secret messages in my ear. It's a pleasure to
translate to Hebrew.
Exactly.
Okay, now you can understand better.
Confuse me even more. I'm at a bit of a disadvantage because I don't speak Hebrew. I'll try and be brief. Are there opportunities for Israel? Yes, there are always opportunities for Israel. One of the opportunities you have, I think, is you live in in terms of the overall region, very turbulent and absolutely horrifically bloody times. And there are 2 areas, I think, where Israel's interests and that of part of Syria, particularly the Syrian opposition, overlap. One is and I think this was, Orit went into this a little earlier, and we've been discussing it, General Gilad did as well. Iranian influence in Syria is spreading, and what I mean by Iranian influence is not Iranian troops, but IRGC, Quds Force, Hezbollah, Shia-inspired groups. It's very clear what it is. In all the years I lived in Syria, which were many, we never saw Iranian influence, direct Iranian influence, like this on the ground. That's something that the majority of the opposition, the Sunni-dominated opposition, does not want in Syria. And I think that's where there's obviously some areas for potential opportunities and discussions. The other area of opportunity, I think, and that is that many in the opposition do not want the jihadists. And unfortunately, what we do know from the do-nothing stand by and let Syria burn policy, which is what American policy is, and also many countries as well, is that that's all fine and well, but when it's spilling out over its borders and infecting neighboring countries as well as the entire world, in the case here, probably the worst example is ISIS, we need to understand that many people in the opposition do not want these jihadists, and I think Israel doesn't want them as well. And you have both on your borders now in the Golan. You have both these Hezbollah-inspired groups as well as the jihadists. So this is another area of opportunity to reach out to particularly the moderates in the opposition who have been weakened over time as the world stood by and did nothing.
Can you find the moderates' opposition in Syria today?
Well, they have been weakened tremendously. That's not a secret. They exist in neighboring countries. The problem is that I think they do not see a strong horse leading them out of this. And while there have been also politically, it's hard for them to follow because all of the support that they've received. I mean, one of the downsides of covert support is that it's very difficult for the Syrians to follow it politically, right? Because it's not spoken of openly. So it creates a complication. I think that one of the areas where you can reach out, first reach out, is remember that Syrians at the hands of their regime, and now at the hands of ISIS, although in lesser numbers, but I suspect it'll go up, are suffering horrific slaughter. I mean, I don't know whether it's genocide or mass slaughter. I'm not an expert on these things, but I think this is something Israelis can relate to, right? And they face this on a daily basis. And the question is, how and what should Israel do in this particular situation? And I think in Syria, probably it makes sense, given Israel's border along the Golan, to start in southern Syria and to look for opportunities there, both in confronting the Iranian forces and rolling back the jihadists. And you can do that, I think, by having a very human conversation, assistance with medical care, assistance with food, and also then looking at other opportunities going forward.
Do you see any, we have a lot of information and descriptions and things like that now that the local communities gain their power and influence, not only the jihadists. The communities understand that they have to take care about their future and they have to take the responsibility. There is any way to coordinate, to cooperate with the level of the local communities because this is the down. Okay.
Sure, and I think in southern Syria this is particularly important. So two things I would hold out. One is the Sunni community in Syria is not monolithic, and so you have of the Sunnis you have the general Harani community, and there could be outreach to that community specifically, and they have. It's very complicated to talk about in this forum, but there are many ways you could reach out to them. And many intermediaries. The other main community that I see would be the Druze. And there we've seen, they're in a really tight spot because traditionally Druze have participated in the regime's military security services. And it's a minority system. Assad's system was a minority system. And before it was destabilized and crippled, they participated more fully. Now they're realizing that they have to live with this crippled Assad regime too. That is not going to come to the rescue and save them. They have to fend for themselves. So how do they do that? And I think it's there that they have seen this idea of not picking a fight with the overall Sunni opposition. The problem is the jihadists, though, because the jihadists are unpredictable. And perhaps that's one common fear, the unpredictability of jihadists, that can link Israel, the moderate Sunnis, and the Druze together going forward.
Another question. On the one hand, we have a feeling that actually in our relations with Egypt, we are in a certain peak with the common interest to cope with the jihadist terror, what's happening in Sinai, including the fact that you're one that gives the permission to the Arab military to act in Sinai against the threat while you're serving us. But regarding Gaza, there's a feeling that our interests there are sort of fading away because the Egyptians decided Hamas is not going to control Gaza. And Israel is afraid of all the alternatives to the Hamas because she doesn't see any better ones. Is there a way to come to some agreement between us and the Egyptians regarding Gaza?
One of the challenges in this discussion as well is reality versus delusions. And it's true that peace with Palestinians is very important, but we also need to know the data and the figures. These days, Abu Mazen, I'm not saying it is criticism, but unfortunately these are the figures, this is the data. He controls Judea and Samaria. He is the chairman of the PLO, which is the overall organization, but it is impossible for him to go back to Gaza. So he can perhaps, maybe once he can visit there. He has a house there, but he can't really practically be there. And in practice, the Hamas is willing to allow the Palestinian Authority, which is a result of our agreement with the PLO, to be in the passages as long as they don't control them. And they want to control them without Hamas, so that's not going to happen. And Hamas is very strong. You can only remove it by force. And if you remove it by force, which is a very popular notion among certain people, then militarily speaking, it's possible, but it's like eating the entire cow instead of eating a steak. Who's going to control it? Who's going to run the education programs, the water? It's very difficult. There are 1,800,000 people there. I don't know if we will get there or not, but we shouldn't be happy to do it. And the Egyptians, when they see Gaza, I mean, people here have said also publicly, a brilliant idea, technically speaking. We'll take 500,000 people from Gaza and we move them to Sinai. Sinai is empty and Gaza is very crowded. Excellent. But nobody's going to do that. The Egyptians aren't willing to have a single Palestinian there unless it is an agent or a diplomat. The Egyptians view Gaza as part of the Palestinian entity, and that is an Israeli problem, and they are under our occupation. And if we want to annex it to us, then it's quite a large country. There are 90 million people, and they don't have a dream of having the Palestinians from Gaza there as well. They were already there once before, so in order to be very clear, there is no way that Egypt will accept Gaza, and there is no way that Hamas will accept the Palestinian Authority. However, Hamas will do everything in its power in order to expand its control through terrorism, because, by the way, the greatest center is not Gaza, it is Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem. There's nothing they can do. They're working from Gaza because that's where they are. But recently, 96 terrorists were uncovered in Judea and Samaria. That is huge, and they didn't really have peace intentions. They wanted to remove Abu Mazen from office in bloody means. And there were conflicts between Dekel, who has become a pet of certain organizations, and Abu Mazen, who has become Dekelan's enemy, who is willing to collaborate with their enemy, Hamas, because they hate one another as long as they all go against Abu Mazen. So all of that is quite bad for the chances for peace. And therefore, I unfortunately believe we would be happy if we were to be able to get to an agreement very quickly. But unfortunately, I think we need to focus on the practical front. The Egyptians' position is very clear. Hamas is an enemy. The current President Sisi doesn't use double standard. I don't want to compare him to others. He says, Hamas is my enemy, and quickly they uncovered 2,000 entrances to terror tunnels. They immediately had a buffer zone declared, which is a very active step, and Hamas has been declared an enemy because they are giving auspices to all sorts of IS elements, and they are also being perceived as part of the Muslim Brotherhood, which the Egyptians are now against. And the reason why the conflict, the operation in Gaza was prolonged is because Israel went with the Egyptian initiative, whereas Qatar had encouraged Mashal, the head of Hamas, to collaborate and to continue as much as possible. Whereas when we see the Hamas leadership, such as Hania and so forth, they have a different ratio between how much they speak and how much they do. So all of this business means that we are very far removed from any feasible action. And I'm not even talking about, maybe it doesn't have to do with people here, but Abu Mazen, who has declared, who has launched a political war against us. So the Palestinian issue, if we don't resolve it, I think will not allow the relationship to be normalized. And even if we do have a Palestinian state, there are other issues at hand, because we're not going to speak about that because we have to speak about opportunities. And again, what does this mean? It means that practically speaking, we can really take huge strides, unprecedented strides, because knowing that Arab people's heads are being cut off, all sorts of Copts who are being beheaded. I don't need to repeat that, but that does create common grounds versus or against these groups. And again, democratization is something that I do believe in, but I don't think it is feasible. You cannot force culture upon someone who does not want it. I think it's condescending. Will we tell Egypt to be a democracy? What sort of democracy? They have their own sort of democracy. I personally would rather support, maybe it sounds dark and conservative, and to Americans it sounds horrible, but I would rather support stability. But why? What does that mean? The social networks are great. They're innovative, and they challenge the present, and it's very difficult to predict what happens on the street, and therefore this sort of area is very important because it makes us feel humble, even if we are very sure of our predictions, then we still can be surprised by young people. So all of this research is so important, it cannot be underestimated, and it will create surprises in the future. But in the absence of tools, I cannot affect electricity or water. You can do some things, but at the end of the day, democracy and the other democracy can be unstable, whereas these other regimes are stable. Perhaps Saudi Arabia is on the clock. Perhaps other predictions will take place only in 100 years. But unlike intelligence, what are the alternatives? And a stable world is this conservative world. And of course you can challenge it, and therefore this social network research is very important. So once it comes upon the surface, it becomes a reason for going against Israel. Israel can attract a lot of feelings of anti, and perhaps it hasn't been reiterated here. I think it can be underscored further. We are not understood on the Arab streets. Normalcy is very far behind, but the undercurrents are very surprising. And I'm not saying this based on sort of strange predictions, but I'm telling you that there's a lot to be done in future. Thank you very much. Elie, I'd like to ask you one final question because we have 1 minute and 19 seconds left. I see the clock here. Now 15 seconds. I'll give you 4 back. Orit spoke about something, that there is perhaps an expectation that Israel will give of its special capabilities to the Arab world. Is it all feasible? Energy, water technology, high-tech, things like that are done not top-down but bottom-up. I think that first and foremost it is possible, because when you talk about on one-on-one, when you speak with politicians, especially with business people, they are very interested in this. But under the current circumstances, it cannot happen. What can happen? It will continue to happen underground, under the surface. And we must remember that in response to what Amos Gilad has said, we must assume responsibility. We spoke before about the Arabs in Israel who don't take responsibility for the decisions they made. We have to assume responsibility for the things that we do. If we don't accept if we're not accepted here in this region, it means 2 things. First, there could be animosity, or we can be unaccepted here. But if we're not accepted, it's also a result of the things that we do, and we have to be responsible for that part as well. And if I see things right, we cannot deal with the ideology of those who reject us and don't want us around. But I think, and I want to tie this in with a previous session, and we heard it well, we heard the Arab speakers we heard different voices if you listen carefully. And those voices are heard in the Arab world as well. And these same voices brought about the Arab Peace Initiative. And I think that we are not making enough use, we are not listening intently enough to those voices, because we keep insisting on listening only to Al-Qaeda and ISIS and so forth. And here in this equation, we have to make a change in the way that we look at the other side. Very nice. I think that is a well-phrased summation of what happened here, that we need to learn to listen to the new voices and keep seeking the new opportunities, because in this region, when there are so many risks and problems, there are also opportunities, and that is part of the idea that we're trying to lead here in this conference, to look for the opportunity, to look for the initiative, because a lot can be impacted here. So thank you all very much for your time. Thank you to those who have survived this entire day from morning to this point. Tomorrow we will begin at 9 a.m. Thank you very much.